The city exhaled a plume of icy November air, but Alina Sanchez felt a different kind of cold. It seeped up from the concrete through her worn-out shoes, a deep, gnawing chill that had little to do with the weather. 9 months pregnant, her body was a battleground of aches, hunger, and the fierce protective love for the life stirring within her. She sat huddled in a recessed doorway, a ghost against the backdrop of glittering storefronts and hurried footsteps. A businessman, his face a mask of annoyance, tossed a crumpled dollar bill near her feet without breaking stride, the gesture more an act of dismissal than charity. She watched it land, a green stain on the grey pavement. She didn't move to pick it up. The humiliation was a heavier weight than the hunger. She was not a beggar. She was a mother waiting to be born. Her world had shrunk to this single, desperate point. The laughter of couples walking past was a sound from another universe, a life she had almost touched. She clutched the thin fabric of her coat, her fingers tracing the outline of a faded photograph tucked in her pocket, a picture of her and Javier, his arm wrapped around her, his smile so full of promises. He was gone, swallowed by the very city that now refused to see her. They had called his death an accident, his fault. They had erased him with a single, sterile report. But inside her, his legacy kicked. This child was the last piece of him, the final verse of their unfinished song. She would not let him be born into a world that had branded his father a failure. She had tried. She had walked until her feet were swollen and raw, seeking help from clinics with long lines and shelters with no beds. Each closed door felt like a physical blow, another layer of invisibility cloaking her. People saw the swollen belly, the dirt-smudged cheeks, and they saw a problem. A statistic, a mistake. They didn't see the woman who whispered lullabies to her unborn son in the dead of night, who saved half a stale bagel for later, just in case he was hungry too. They didn't see the dignity she held onto like a shield, the quiet fury that burned beneath her exhaustion. She wasn't asking for pity. She was demanding a sliver of justice in a world that had taken everything. A sharp, tightening pain shot through her lower back, making her gasp. It was different from the hunger pangs, more profound, more urgent. It was a signal. The baby was coming. She placed a protective hand over her belly, a wave of primal fear washing over her, followed by an even stronger wave of resolve. Not here. Not on this cold, indifferent sidewalk. Her son would not take his first breath as a casualty of the street. He deserved more. He deserved a name cleared of lies, a future free from the shadow of injustice. He deserved a father remembered not as a careless worker, but as the hero he was. The pain came again, a fierce reminder that her time was running out. Lifting her head, Alina's gaze fell upon the horizon, where a tower of glass and steel pierced the grey sky. Thorn Tower. The name was a brand on her heart, the headquarters of the man whose company had signed Javier's death warrant and then discarded his memory. The pain inside her sharpened, no longer just physical, but a blade of pure and focused rage. The city's noise faded into a dull roar. There was only the tower, a monument to the power that had crushed her. She pushed herself to her feet, every muscle screaming in protest. She trembled, but not from the cold anymore. It was the terror of what she was about to do and the terrifying certainty that she had no other choice. One way or another, they would hear her. The tower was a needle against the bruised sky, a monument to a world that had forgotten her. Each step Alina took toward its glass and steel facade was a battle against the searing pain in her back and the tremor in her legs. She was no longer just a woman. She was a vessel of memory and a promise of justice. The city's indifferent crowd swirled around her, but she saw only the polished doors of Thorn Tower, the gate to the man who had signed Javier's death certificate with cold, corporate ink. She clutched her swollen belly, a silent vow passing between her and her unborn son. This was not for her. This was for him, so he would never have to carry the weight of a lie. The world would see a madwoman. She only hoped he would feel a warrior. She reached the lobby, a cavern of marble and hushed importance where she was as invisible as a ghost. The security guards, with their stern faces and perfect uniforms, were an impenetrable wall. Her direct plea would be met with dismissal. Desperation, however, is a mother of invention. Taking a shaky breath, Alina let her body go limp, a strangled gasp escaping her lips as she crumpled to the floor right in front of the main entrance. Her eyes fluttered shut, her hand protectively on her stomach. It was a performance fueled by the rawest truth. Panic erupted. People stopped, Voices rose in alarm, and the guards rushed toward her, their focus entirely on the pregnant woman seemingly in crisis on their pristine floor. The distraction was set. In the ensuing chaos, her moment arrived. As one guard knelt beside her and another radioed for medical assistance, Alina pushed herself up with a surge of adrenaline. She moved with a speed that belied her condition, a shadow slipping past the distracted reception desk. A woman in a sharp business suit recoiled as Alina brushed past, her expression a mask of pure disgust. The judgment was instantaneous, a silent condemnation of her dirty coat and desperate eyes. Alina ignored it, her gaze locked on the private elevator bank at the far end of the lobby. She pressed the button for the top floor, the point of no return. The doors slid shut, sealing her inside the gilded cage, her reflection a haunting image of a woman on the edge of everything. The ascent was unnervingly silent, a smooth, swift climb into the heavens of power and wealth. Inside the mirrored elevator, Alina saw not herself, but a stranger, a feral creature with tangled hair and a fire of righteous fury in her eyes. Another contraction seized her, a brutal, tightening grip that stole her breath. She braced herself against the cool metal wall, gritting her teeth against the pain, whispering Javier's name like a prayer. Was she a criminal for demanding to be heard? Was she insane for fighting for a dead man's honor? The world would say yes. But in the sterile silence of that rising box, she knew she was simply a mother, and that was a force more powerful and more primal than any law or judgment. The elevator doors opened onto a silent, opulent corridor. There was only one destination, a pair of imposing oak doors with a simple, silver plaque that read, Adrian Thorne. She didn't hesitate. There was no time for doubt. With the last of her strength, she threw her shoulder against the heavy wood, bursting into the room. The office was vast, a minimalist cathedral of glass and steel overlooking the entire city, and there he was, a man silhouetted against the panoramic window, his back to her. He didn't turn. He didn't move. Without thinking, the words ripped from her throat, raw and accusatory, shattering the perfect silence. "You have to listen to me," she cried, her voice cracking. "Why you owe him that much? You owe us that." Before the man at the desk could react, his executive assistant, a woman with immaculate hair and a look of sheer horror, rushed in from a side door. "Mr. Thorne, I am so sorry. Security is on its way up." Her eyes, cold and sharp, raked over Alina, dismissing her entire existence in a single, withering glance. She saw only a problem to be disposed of, a stain on the day's perfect agenda. "Ma'am, you cannot be in here," the assistant hissed, her voice low and venomous as she tried to grab Alina's arm. "You need to leave right now." The assistant was the system personified, polished, merciless, and utterly convinced of her own righteousness in protecting the powerful from the inconvenient. The commotion drew others. Faces began to appear in the doorway, curious, scornful employees drawn to the drama. Their whispers were like 1,000 tiny cuts. And look at the state of her. Is she homeless? She's probably trying to extort him. They didn't see a grieving partner or an expectant mother. They saw a spectacle, a piece of gutter trash that had somehow sullied their sanctuary. Alina stood her ground, her chin held high, but their collective judgment was a crushing weight. She was surrounded, publicly shamed, her desperate plea for justice twisted into an act of aggression and lunacy. In that moment, she was utterly alone, an outcast in a world that had already decided who she was without ever hearing her story. If this story is touching you, please like and share. There are so many people living this silently. To any witness, her actions were indefensible. She was a trespasser, an aggressor, a woman unhinged by poverty or delusion. Her dirty clothes and wild eyes told a simple story of threat and instability. But they could not see the worn photograph in her pocket, a picture of two people smiling, their future bright and full of promise. They could not hear the echo of Javier's last voicemail, his voice filled with worry about the very negligence that killed him. Her invasion was not an act of malice, but an act of profound love. It was a desperate, messy, and courageous demand for dignity in a world that offered none. And as she stood there, judged by all, her body was preparing for its own final, undeniable truth. Adrian Thorne did not command his empire from a throne of gold, but from a minimalist altar of glass and chrome. His office, occupying the entire top floor of Thorn Tower, was less a workspace and more a testament to absolute control. Every surface was polished, every line was clean, and the silence was so profound it felt curated. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city sprawled below him. A complex machine he understood and manipulated with detached precision. He was a man who had mastered the world by building impenetrable walls, not just of glass and steel, but around a heart that had been shattered a decade ago. The order he imposed on his surroundings was a desperate, daily battle against the chaos of memory. The sudden, violent sound of his office doors bursting open was more than an interruption. It was a sacrilege. It was a crack in the perfect facade of his world. Alina Sanchez stumbled into the room, a maelstrom of desperation in a dirty coat. She was everything his world was not: messy, unpredictable, and painfully alive. Her swollen belly, her tangled hair, the wild, hunted look in her eyes. It was all an assault on the sterile peace he had so carefully constructed. Adrian didn't turn at first. He held his position, a silhouette against the city, letting the silence stretch. A subtle assertion of his power. He would deal with this intrusion on his own terms, as he dealt with everything. When he finally swiveled his massive leather chair, his face was a study in cold indifference. His grey eyes, famous for dismantling corporate rivals, swept over her. He didn't see a woman on the brink of collapse. He saw a calculated performance, the torn clothes, the advanced pregnancy. It was a textbook play for sympathy, an amateurish attempt at extortion. In his mind, she was already categorized and dismissed. He felt a familiar wave of irritation, the same he felt when a deal soured or a subordinate failed. She was not a person in pain. She was a variable he had not accounted for, a messy piece of data that needed to be deleted from his system immediately. Her voice, raw and trembling, shattered the silence. "You have to listen to me," she cried, the words tearing from her throat. "You owe him that much." "You owed us that." The plea hung in the air for a moment before dissolving against the wall of his apathy. To him, her words were meaningless, the desperate script of 1,000 con artists who saw his name as a lottery ticket. He didn't hear the grief for a lost partner. He heard an accusation, a demand. He had built his fortune on the principle that he owed no one anything. His hand moved with an unnerving calm toward the sleek silver intercom on his desk, his finger hovering over the button that would summon security and erase her from his sight. Before he could press it, his executive assistant, a woman whose composure was as flawless as her designer suit, rushed in from a side office. "Mr. Thorn, I am so sorry. Security is on its way up." Her eyes, sharp and merciless, sliced over Alina, her expression a mixture of horror and contempt. This was not just an intruder. This was a contamination. "Ma'am, you cannot be in here," she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper as she moved to intercept Alina. The assistant was the system's first line of defense, a perfectly manicured barrier designed to protect the powerful from the inconvenient truths of the world they ruled from above. The commotion drew an audience. Faces, curious, disdainful, entertained, began to appear at the doorway. Employees, drawn by the breach in protocol, whispered among themselves. Their hushed words were like stones, each one a small, sharp judgment. "Look at her. Is she homeless? She's trying to get a payday." They transformed her private agony into a public spectacle, a piece of lunchtime drama. Alina stood frozen in the center of the room, their collective scorn pressing in on her, stripping away what little dignity she had left. She was an animal in a cage, surrounded by spectators who saw her not as a human being, but as a dangerous and pathetic creature. The contrast was staggering, a silent scream that echoed in the vast office. His world was one of polished Italian leather and panoramic city views, a life insulated from consequence. Her world was one of cracked pavement and the gnawing ache of hunger, a life defined by it. The priceless Persian rug beneath her feet was worth more than everything she had ever owned. He was a man who moved markets with a single word. She was a woman whose pleas were not even heard. The chasm between them was not merely financial, it was a moral abyss. A stark portrait of a city that allowed one man to touch the sky while a woman was left to perish on its streets. Finally, Adrian spoke. His voice was not loud, not angry, but something far worse. It was utterly devoid of feeling. It was the calm, measured tone of a man archiving a file, closing a case. "Remove her," he commanded, his words directed not at Alina but at the uniformed security guards who now flanked her. He had already turned his chair back toward the window, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon, as if she had already ceased to exist. He was dismissing her from his office, from his day, from his reality. The conflict was set. The immovable object of his walled-off heart had just collided with the unstoppable force of a mother's desperate love. And the impact was about to shatter everything. The security guards advanced, their movements practiced and impersonal. They were not men, but functions, extensions of the tower's sterile will. Yet, as they reached for Alina, she flinched away, not with fear, but with a surge of pure, unyielding pride. "Don't touch me," she rasped, her voice a low growl that held them at bay. Her body was a territory she would not cede, though she trembled from pain and exhaustion. Her eyes burned with a fire that belied her broken appearance. She was a queen defending the last square inch of her crumbling kingdom. In that moment, she wasn't a beggar to be discarded. She was a force to be reckoned with, a mother protecting her unborn child from the cold hands of a world that had already taken too much. Adrian watched the standoff from the throne of his leather chair, a flicker of something unreadable in his gaze. This was not the pathetic, weeping plea he had anticipated. This was resistance. It was illogical, infuriating, and it disrupted the clean, predictable lines of his day. He had built an empire on the principle that every problem had a simple, decisive solution, and the solution here was removal. Yet he hesitated, his finger still hovering over the intercom. The sheer audacity of her defiance, the way she held the gazes of two men twice her size, was an anomaly. It was a piece of data that didn't fit his algorithm of the world, and for a man who detested uncertainty, it was profoundly unsettling. He was still in control, but the foundations of his certainty had begun to tremble. His assistant, sensing his hesitation, stepped forward like a loyal viper. Her voice was smooth, a silken delivery for a poisoned sentiment. "Perhaps we can be reasonable," she said, her eyes fixed on Alina with undisguised contempt. She opened her purse and retrieved a crisp $100 bill, holding it out between two perfectly manicured fingers. "Mr. Thorne is a generous man. Take this and go. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." The gesture was a calculated humiliation, an attempt to reduce Alina's crusade for justice into a petty shakedown. It was an offer to buy her silence, to purchase her dignity for a pittance. The air crackled with the insult, a clear line drawn between their world of transactional power and her world of intangible loss. Alina stared at the bill as if it were a burning coal. She didn't even glance at the assistant. Her eyes remained locked on Adrian, the true architect of her pain. A bitter, tearless laugh escaped her lips. $100, she whispered, the sound echoing in the cavernous office. "Is that what a man's honor is worth in this tower?" She straightened her back, a fresh wave of pain washing over her, but she ignored it. "I don't want your money. It's stained with my Javier's blood. I want you to say his name. I want you to admit you were wrong." Her refusal was a grenade tossed into the room's tense silence. She was not a problem to be paid off. She was a debt to be acknowledged, and she would not be moved. The security guards exchanged an uncertain look. Their training had not prepared them for this. They were equipped to handle threats, not declarations of moral warfare. One of them, a man with tired eyes and a daughter of his own, found his gaze drifting to Alina's swollen abdomen. The professional mask he wore began to crack, revealing a flicker of human empathy. This was no longer a simple extraction. It was something more complicated, more human. The system's enforcers were beginning to feel the weight of the system's cruelty. Their hesitation was a small but significant victory for Alina, a sign that her raw humanity was a weapon more powerful than any corporate protocol. The chasm between them was still vast, but a single, fragile bridge of shared feeling was beginning to form. Adrian's patience finally snapped. The whispers from the doorway, the insubordination of a vagrant, the wavering of his own staff. It was an unacceptable breakdown of order. He rose from his chair, his tall frame casting a long, intimidating shadow across the room. His voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it cut through the air like a shard of ice. "I have built this city from nothing," he stated, each word a perfectly polished stone of arrogance. I will not be lectured on honor by someone who trespassed into my office. You have 1 minute to leave under your own power. After that, you will be removed. And I will personally ensure you are charged to the fullest extent of the law. His threat was absolute, the final move of a king cornered by a pawn. But her body had its own timeline, one that cared little for threats or 60-second ultimatums. A contraction, more powerful and vicious than any before, ripped through her. A strangled cry escaped her lips as her knees buckled. She stumbled backward, her hand reaching out to steady herself against a cold, abstract metal sculpture worth more than a small house. The defiant fire in her eyes was extinguished, replaced by a wave of pure, primal pain. The spectacle was over. The warrior had fallen. There was only a young woman, terrified and alone, her body in the violent, sacred act of bringing a new life into a world that had shown her nothing but cruelty. The raw, undeniable truth of her condition filled the room, silencing every whisper. "It's a performance, sir. A classic manipulation tactic," the assistant insisted, her voice sharp and certain. Her prejudice was a fortress, impenetrable to the sight of genuine suffering. To her, Alina's agony was just another move in a desperate game, a final, pathetic bid for sympathy. She saw weakness not as a human state, but as a tool of the weak to exploit the strong. Her words were a desperate attempt to reinforce Adrian's cynicism, to rebuild the wall around his heart that Alina's raw pain had just begun to crack. She was the voice of the system, fighting to maintain its cold, rational order against the chaotic intrusion of human suffering. She was defending her world, a world where compassion was a liability. But Adrian was no longer listening to his assistant. He was hearing an echo from a decade ago. He saw the sweat on Alina's brow, the terror in her eyes as she fought for breath. And he was no longer in his office. He was in a sterile, white hospital room, holding his wife's hand as her own body betrayed her. The same primal fear, the same desperate fight. It was a ghost rising from a grave he had spent 10 years trying to seal shut. The carefully constructed order of his world was a lie, a thin veneer over a well of unbearable pain. He looked at Alina, truly looked at her for the first time, and he didn't see an intruder or a con artist. He saw the reflection of his own greatest loss, and the ice around his heart began to groan under the pressure. Alina felt the last of her strength abandon her. The righteous anger that had carried her here had been washed away by a tide of overwhelming fear. Her plan, so clear and focused in her mind, had dissolved. She was no longer a soldier fighting for a dead man's name. She was just a mother. Terrified she was about to fail her child before he even took his first breath, her gaze found Adrian's. Across the vast expanse of the room, the defiance was gone, replaced by a silent, desperate plea that stripped away all pretense of their conflict. It was not the plea of a victim to a powerful man, but of one soul in agony to another, a raw and universal appeal for help in the face of life's most terrifying and beautiful moment. The guards took a step forward, their faces impassive, their hands ready. They were the system's final answer, the physical embodiment of Adrian Thorne's command to erase her. But as they closed in, Alina's body issued its own, more powerful verdict. A contraction, sharper and more brutal than any before, seized her from within. It was a white-hot blade of pain that stole her breath and shattered her will. A cry tore from her throat, a sound stripped of all defiance, leaving only the raw terror of a body in revolt. Her knees gave way, and she crumpled onto the plush fibers of the Persian rug, the world dissolving into a dizzying vortex of agony. The warrior was gone. The trespasser had vanished. All that remained was a terrified girl, about to become a mother on the floor of her enemy. His assistant, ever loyal to the fortress of cynicism they had built, rushed to his side. "It's a performance, sir. A classic manipulation tactic," she whispered, her voice a sharp, sterile instrument meant to cut through the messy display of human suffering. She saw not a woman in labor, but a final, desperate card being played. To her, this was a calculated act of weakness, a pathetic bid to exploit the very compassion she believed was a liability in their world. Her words were a frantic attempt to reinforce the cold logic that had always governed Thorne Tower, to remind her boss that emotion was a currency for the poor and a trap for the powerful. She was defending the sanctity of their detachment, fighting to keep the chaos of real life from breaching their walls. But Adrian Thorne was no longer in his office. He was adrift in time, pulled back a decade by the sheer force of memory. The opulent room melted away, replaced by the sterile white glare of a hospital delivery suite. Alina's pained gasp was not her own. It was the echo of his wife, Elena, her hand clutching his, her eyes wide with the same primal fear. He saw the sweat on Alina's brow and remembered the cool cloth he had used to wipe Elena's. He heard the ragged breathing and recalled the sound of the failing heart monitor. The grief he had buried under 10 years of relentless work and self-imposed solitude erupted, a tidal wave of pain that left him breathless. He was paralyzed, not by shock, but by the ghost of her agony he thought he had outrun. Through the haze of her own torment, Alina's eyes found his. The fire was gone, washed away by a flood of tears and terror. She was no longer a crusader for a dead man's honor. She was a mother, and her child was coming here in this cold, merciless place. All her plans, all her anger, had dissolved into a single, terrifying reality. Her hand, trembling, pressed against her swollen belly, as if to protect her son from the world he was about to enter. Her voice, when it came, was a fragile, broken whisper that sliced through the silence and directly into the deepest wound in Adrian's soul. "Please," she begged, the word a complete surrender. "He's going to be born right here." It was not an accusation. It was a prophecy of shared trauma. That sentence, "he's going to be born right here," was not just words. It was the key that unlocked the frozen chamber of Adrian's heart. It was the precise fear that had become his devastating reality 10 years ago. The pronoun he echoed the son he never held, and the immediacy of right here mirrored the horrifying loss of control that had defined his life ever since. The carefully constructed ice around his soul did not just crack, it shattered into a million irreparable pieces. For the first time in a decade, he felt something other than the dull ache of absence. He felt Alina's terror as if it were his own. He felt the crushing weight of her vulnerability, and in it, he saw the ghost of his own humanity staring back at him. The paralysis broke. Adrian moved with a sudden, explosive urgency that shocked everyone in the room. He spun on the 2 security guards, his voice a raw, guttural command that was utterly alien to them. "Don't touch her," he roared. The sound echoing off the glass walls. The guards froze, their professional composure shattered. He then turned to his stunned assistant, his eyes blazing with a fire she had never witnessed. "Call Dr. Alistair. Tell him it's a code red. Then get an ambulance to the private entrance, now." His orders were no longer about dismissal and containment. They were about preservation, about protection. The indifferent king had abdicated his throne, replaced in an instant by a desperate, flawed and profoundly human guardian. While his staff scrambled into panicked action, Adrian did something that defied the very essence of his public persona. He tore off his exquisitely tailored Brioni jacket, the armor he wore against the world, and let it fall from his hand. He looked lost for a second, a man unpracticed in the simple mechanics of care. Then he sank to his knees on the floor beside Alina, a position of humility he had not taken for anyone. With hands that trembled almost imperceptibly, he folded the rich, dark wool of the jacket and gently slid it beneath her head, a makeshift pillow offering a sliver of comfort. It was a gesture that cost him thousands of dollars in fabric, but it was worth a universe in meaning. It was an act of penance. As he knelt there, a small, worn photograph slipped from the pocket of Alina's coat, landing face up on the rug between them. It was a picture of her and a young man, his arm wrapped around her shoulders, their smiles so full of life and unburdened hope that it hurt to look at. This was Javier. In that single, faded image, Adrian saw the whole story. This was not a grifter. This was a woman who had lost everything, a love story brutally cut short. The neat, simple lie he had constructed about her, the angry, unstable extortionist, crumbled into dust. The truth, in all its devastating clarity, was right there at his feet. His judgment had not just been wrong, it had been a sin of the highest order. The entire atmosphere in the room shifted. The voyeuristic whispers from the doorway ceased, replaced by a stunned, collective silence. Scornful expressions melted into a mixture of shock and dawning shame. They were no longer watching a corporate drama. They were bearing witness to something ancient, terrifying, and sacred. Adrian's assistant stood frozen, the phone pressed to her ear, her face pale. The social canyon that had separated the powerful from the powerless had vanished. In its place was a shared, fragile space of raw humanity, created by the undeniable power of a new life demanding its entrance. In this temple built to profit and power, the most primal force of all was taking over, and it was remaking every soul in the room. Do you believe in second chances? Comment below. We want to hear from you. Adrian remained on his knees, a silent sentinel by her side. He didn't dare touch her, but he refused to abandon her. He was no longer Adrian Thorne, the titan of industry. He was just a man, stripped bare before the violent miracle of birth, watching a ghost from his past offer him the most unexpected and painful path to redemption. He looked at Alina's face, contorted in agony, but radiating a ferocity he had never known, and saw a strength that humbled him. The walls around his heart were gone. The pain of the past was no longer a memory but a living presence. Yet, for the first time in a decade, a fragile, terrifying seedling of hope began to push its way through the ashes of his grief. The chaos of the office dissolved into the sterile, hushed efficiency of a private hospital wing. Adrian Thorne had moved heaven and earth with a few terse phone calls, transforming from a titan of industry into a frantic, clumsy guardian. He did not enter the delivery room. That was a sacred space he could not bear to profane with his ghosts. Instead, he waited in the corridor, a solitary, haunted figure who refused to leave. When the doctor finally emerged, exhaustion and wonder on his face, and announced the birth of a healthy baby boy, Adrian felt not the familiar stab of grief, but a fragile, unfamiliar sense of relief. He had not run from the pain this time. He had stood his ground, and in doing so had helped shepherd a new life into the world, a small act of penance for the one he had lost. Fueled by a righteous fury he hadn't felt in a decade, Adrian returned to his tower not as its king, but as its judge. He bypassed his executives and launched his own relentless investigation into Javier Sanchez's death. He spent sleepless nights poring over safety reports, personnel files, and construction logs, his legendary business acumen now a tool for moral excavation. Alina, from her hospital bed, gave him the key, the last voicemail from Javier, his voice full of love and a specific, chilling worry about unsecured steel beams. The recording was the ghost in the machine, the undeniable proof of a cover-up. Adrian listened to it once, his face a mask of stone, and knew that the rot within his company went deeper than he could have ever imagined. He was not just fixing a mistake, he was cleansing a sin. The public apology was unprecedented. Adrian Thorne, a man who had never admitted fault in his life, stood before a wall of cameras and reporters and did more than just accept liability. He spoke Javier Sanchez's name with a reverence that silenced the room, detailing the corporate negligence that led to his death and the subsequent, shameful cover-up. He announced the immediate termination of the managers responsible and the establishment of a new, foundation-wide safety protocol named in Javier's honor. He looked directly into the main camera, but his words were for an audience of one. "We failed him," Adrian stated, his voice thick with an emotion no one had ever heard from him. "We failed his memory, and we failed his family. That failure ends today." It was not a press release, it was a confession. The material restitution was swift and absolute, but it was delivered with a quiet respect that stripped it of any charity. A fully furnished, sunlit apartment was secured for Alina, a safe harbor far from the cold streets. A substantial trust fund was established in her son's name, guaranteeing not wealth, but opportunity, for education, for security, for a future unburdened by the struggles of his birth. Alina accepted it all with a profound, quiet dignity. This was not a gift, it was justice, the long overdue payment on a debt of honor. Standing in her new home, holding her sleeping son, Javier, she had named him, she felt the crushing weight of survival finally lift from her shoulders, replaced by the gentle, hopeful gravity of a life about to be lived. Their final meeting was not one of words, but of shared silence. Adrian visited the apartment once, standing awkwardly in the doorway as he looked at the baby sleeping peacefully in his crib. He saw not the ghost of his own lost son, but a symbol of a promise kept, a life that had begun not in tragedy, but in justice. Alina simply nodded, a look of profound, weary gratitude in her eyes. There was no romance between them, nor was there friendship. There was something rarer, a bond forged in the crucible of shared trauma and mutual redemption. He had given her a future, and she, in her moment of ultimate vulnerability, had given him back his soul. As he left, they both knew their wounds had not vanished, but they had finally begun to heal. 6 months later, the city exhaled a soft spring warmth, a gentle promise that even the harshest winters must end. Alina Sanchez stood by the large window of her sunlit apartment, a place that felt less like a home and more like a sanctuary. In her arms, little Javier slept, his tiny chest rising and falling in a rhythm of pure, untroubled peace. She was no longer the ghost of the November streets. She was a mother, a guardian of a legacy. The deep ache of her loss remained, a permanent resident in her heart, but it no longer consumed her. It had been transformed into a quiet strength, a fuel for the fierce, protective love she poured into her son. She had not won a fortune. She had won something far more valuable, a future where her son would know his father's name was synonymous not with failure, but with honor. Adrian Thorne's office was still a monument to minimalist precision, but the silence was different now. It was no longer the sterile, empty silence of a mausoleum, but a contemplative quiet. The panoramic view of the city no longer looked like a map of assets to be controlled, but a tapestry of human lives, each one as fragile and significant as the one that had been born on his floor. The ghost of his wife and son no longer haunted him with paralyzing grief. Instead, their memory had become a quiet whisper, urging him toward the compassion he had locked away for a decade. He had learned that true strength was not in building walls to keep pain out, but in having the courage to let a stranger's pain in. In saving Alina, he had finally begun to salvage the wreckage of himself. The Javier Sanchez Safety Foundation became more than a corporate initiative. It was Adrian's penance and his purpose. He personally oversaw its mission, walking through construction sites not as a distant owner, but as a guardian, his eyes trained to see the human cost behind every steel beam and concrete slab. Javier's death was no longer a forgotten statistic buried in a falsified report. It had become a catalyst, a tragic lesson that echoed through the industry, forcing a reckoning with the casual disregard for the lives of the unseen. His name, once erased by corporate negligence, was now etched onto safety protocols and training manuals, a permanent reminder that one man's life held immeasurable worth. A life lost had become a legacy that would save countless others, transforming a senseless end into a meaningful beginning. They never met again. There was no need for words, for their stories were now woven into the fabric of each other's healing. Sometimes, from her apartment window, Alina would see the distant needle of Thorne Tower piercing the clouds. It was no longer a symbol of cold, untouchable power, but a strange monument to an impossible connection, a testament to the day the sky bent down to meet the street. And sometimes, late at night, Adrian would look at the single, framed photograph he now kept on his desk, not of his own family, but of a smiling Javier Sanchez. He saw not an employee, but the man whose legacy had inadvertently given him a second chance at his own humanity. Their bond was not in friendship, but in the quiet, profound truth that they had saved each other. One evening, as the sun set the sky ablaze in hues of orange and violet, Alina stood holding her son, who was just beginning to smile. She looked down at the simple, silver key resting in her palm. It was not just the key to her apartment. It was the key to a life she had claimed from the jaws of indifference. It was the weight of security, the shape of dignity, the tangible proof that her fight had mattered. This small piece of metal was heavier than any gold because it had been forged in courage and paid for with a love that death could not extinguish. She held it tight, then gently kissed her son's forehead. The world had tried to break her, to render her invisible, but she had endured. She had become a home for her son, a safe harbor in the storm. She hadn't just fought for a dead man's honor. She had fought for the simple, radical idea that every life matters. In the quiet of her new beginning, holding the future in her arms, she was the living proof that vulnerability is not weakness, but the most powerful force for change on earth. Her son would grow up in a world that knew his father's name, a world where one woman's desperate cry for justice had been heard in the highest tower of the city and had, against all odds, been answered. Dignity, once a distant dream, was now the very air she breathed. If this story moved you, please subscribe to the channel and send this video to someone who needs to believe in hope.